It was supposed to be just another day in court. A standard custody hearing in a quiet Georgia town where the courtroom barely saw drama. But this case was different. Emily Carter sat stiffly in her seat, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. Across from her sat her ex-husband, Officer Daniel Carter, a decorated canine handler in the local police force. His uniform freshly pressed, his face unreadable. Between them stood years of pain, unresolved accusations, and one fragile hope, Mason, their 3-year-old son. Mason was too young to understand the depth of the courtroom battle. Yet, everyone knew his presence mattered. The judge, a stern man with a soft spot for children, had reluctantly allowed him to be present during the final hearing. His child psychologist had deemed it safe. After all, Mason hadn't spoken a single word during the previous hearings. Most assumed he wouldn't speak at all, but this day would not unfold like the others. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, observers, and a handful of local reporters curious about the unusual case. Emily had accused her ex-husband of using his police dog as a weapon against her during an argument over 2 years ago. The allegation was brushed aside at the time. No bruises, no video, no witnesses. Her ex had dismissed it as hysteria, and his badge offered him silent protection. The court had labeled her emotional and granted Daniel partial custody. But Emily had never stopped fighting to protect her son, certain that what had happened that night would one day come to light. Now, Mason sat in a small chair near the witness box, nervously clutching a soft police dog plushie in his lap. His legs dangled, not quite reaching the floor. The judge leaned forward and smiled gently. "Mason," the judge said kindly, "can you tell us how you're feeling today?" Silence. The toddler looked down at his shoes. Emily held her breath. Daniel didn't flinch. And the psychologist leaned forward and asked the question they'd agreed to use. "Mason, do you remember the night your mommy got a boo-boo?" The boy blinked. He looked up. Slowly his eyes moved across the courtroom. They landed on Rex. Rex was Daniel's K-9 partner, a majestic, trained German shepherd who had served the department for years. As a symbolic gesture of transparency, Daniel had brought Rex to court, seated beside the officer near the bench. People had smiled at the sight. Rex was beloved in the town. He had received medals. Children took photos with him at community events. But Mason's reaction was not what anyone expected. His hand trembled as he raised a small finger and pointed straight at the dog. The room seemed to stop breathing. Then, Mason, in a voice so soft it was almost missed, said 2 simple words: "Bad dog." A collective gasp broke out across the courtroom. The judge blinked, confused. One of the lawyers dropped her pen. Even the bailiff, who'd been leaning back casually, stood upright. Emily's lips parted. Her hands covered her mouth as tears instantly welled up in her eyes. She hadn't coached him. She hadn't prepared him to say anything. Mason had never spoken of that night. She had thought, maybe hoped even, that he'd forgotten. But children don't forget the things that scare them most. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "He remembers." Daniel's attorney stood up instantly, objecting. "Your Honor, I don't think the child understands what he's saying. This is inappropriate and misleading." "Sit down," the judge ordered sharply. His eyes never left Mason. The dog, Rex, remained still, ears perked and head high, trained not to react to distractions. He looked like the perfect picture of discipline. But to Mason, that face meant something different, something darker. The judge leaned toward the psychologist. "Doctor, is it possible that this child has formed a false memory or been influenced?" The psychologist shook her head slowly. "No, Mason has never mentioned the dog in therapy. He never even spoke about that night. His reaction is spontaneous. And in my professional opinion, entirely authentic. Emily was now quietly sobbing, her shoulders shaking with the weight of 2 years of doubt finally lifting. Daniel didn't move. His jaw was clenched, but he remained stone-faced. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Your Honor, I request that this courtroom go into recess. Based on the boy's statement, I believe we need to re-examine the original domestic dispute report, especially regarding the involvement of the K-9 unit." The judge didn't respond immediately. He looked again at Mason, who now curled into his seat, his head resting on the stuffed animal in his lap. Everyone in the room understood the impact of what had just happened. In a moment no adult could have planned, a toddler had shattered the silence and reopened a case thought to be buried. With just 2 innocent words, Mason had brought everything into question: the credibility of a trusted officer, the integrity of a police dog, and the justice system's tendency to overlook the voices of the most vulnerable. Court was adjourned for the day, but the world outside the courthouse was just beginning to listen. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with questions. The moment the doors opened, reporters flooded the steps, cameras rolling and microphones pointed at anyone connected to the case. But the only words people could talk about were Mason's bad dog. The phrase was repeated endlessly on social media, in news clips, on the radio. A child's voice whispering those 2 words had pierced through official records, sealed documents, and hardened reputations. Something had shifted. Back. Inside, Judge Halberton called a private meeting in chambers. He ordered all parties back the next morning and demanded access to the original domestic incident report from 2 years ago, one that had barely been reviewed when first filed. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Carter stood in the courthouse parking lot, hands on his hips, facing a storm of media he had never encountered before. Just hours ago, he was a local hero, a decorated officer, and a proud K-9 handler. Now, the trust he'd built was beginning to crack. Rex, the German shepherd at the center of the story, stood silently beside him, his tongue hanging out, panting in the summer heat. Onlookers still stopped to pet him, unaware or unwilling to believe that this dog might be involved in something far darker than a community demonstration. But inside the minds of those closest to the case, doubts had started to bloom. Emily sat in the back of her lawyer's car, still trembling. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her body aching from the emotional weight of the courtroom. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the crazy one. "I never told him anything," she said softly. "Not a word about that." "Night," her lawyer nodded. "Children don't fake trauma." "Not like that." The flashback played on a loop in Emily's mind. That night, the fight with Daniel had escalated quickly, too quickly. She had been terrified, her voice shaking as she pleaded with him to calm down. But something in his eyes had turned cold. That's when he whistled. Rex came running. Emily had fallen. She remembered the sharp bark, the teeth, the pressure on her leg. There were no bite marks, just bruises and scratches, which she was told could have been caused by the fall. Her screams had been dismissed as exaggeration. The department had closed the case within a week. Now, after her son's quiet accusation, it was all being pulled into the light. The next day, court resumed in an even more packed courtroom. News vans lined the block, and the hallway buzzed with whispers. Everyone wanted to see the woman who claimed a police dog had attacked her, and the child who had finally spoken. Judge Halberton wasted no time. This court is now reviewing new evidence that may alter the outcome of this custody hearing and may lead to a reopening of a previously closed domestic abuse case, he announced. The court clerk distributed the original report. As pages were flipped and eyes scanned lines of text, murmurs filled the room. The original responding officer, Officer Jennings, had failed to file a K-9 use of force form required anytime a dog is deployed in a domestic setting. There was no notation that Rex had been involved that night, Jennings was no longer on the force. He had quietly retired. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that key details of the incident were suppressed or intentionally left vague to protect an officer's reputation. We are requesting an independent review of this report, as well as testimony from Officer Jennings. Emily stared straight ahead. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to be believed. Across the room, Daniel sat motionless, but the flush in his face betrayed the pressure mounting inside him. He had expected this to go as planned: win custody, silence the past. But he hadn't counted on Mason's memory. Your Honor, Daniel's attorney began, we can't allow the word of a 3-year-old to derail a man's career and reputation. This is emotional manipulation. The judge raised a hand. I'll be the one to decide what's admissible. The child's testimony is already on record. Now we follow the trail. As the hearing was adjourned for a second review, the courtroom emptied once again. But outside, the narrative was no longer controlled by lawyers or paperwork. It was being driven by the public, hungry for truth and justice. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Emily and hashtag Believe Mason trended nationwide. News anchors debated whether the use of K9 South in domestic calls needed reform. Podcasts picked apart the court footage. Even celebrities shared their thoughts online. Meanwhile, Emily received hundreds of messages from women she had never met. Some were survivors, others mothers, and many simply offered support. For the first time, she felt seen. At home that night, she tucked Mason into bed. He clutched his plush dog tightly, unaware of the movement he had started. Emily leaned over, brushing hair from his forehead. Do you remember why you said that today? She asked gently. Mason looked up with sleepy eyes. He barked and made you fall, he said simply. You cried. Tears filled Emily's eyes again, but this time they weren't from fear or frustration. They were from validation. She kissed his forehead. Thank you, baby. You were so brave. Outside her window, reporters waited, lights flashing in the dark. But inside, for the first time in years, Emily felt peace. The silence had been broken, and the truth was just getting started. 2 years before the courtroom explosion, it was a bitterly cold January night. Emily Carter sat curled on the living room couch, her arms wrapped tightly around a blanket, while Mason, then just a baby, slept in a bassinet by the window. Argument had started like most others, with raised voices over bills, work, and jealousy. But that night, something in Daniel snapped. He slammed the door when he walked in, his boots muddy and his uniform still on. Rex trailed closely behind him, obedient and alert. Emily stood from the couch, immediately sensing something was wrong. Daniel's eyes were bloodshot, and his words slurred slightly. He reeked of alcohol. We need to talk, he growled. Emily held her breath. Mason's asleep. I don't care, he snapped. You've been texting your boss again, haven't you? I saw the messages. There's nothing going on, she insisted, heart racing. It's just work. But Daniel didn't believe her. He never did. Jealousy wasn't new. It had become part of their relationship. This time, though, the anger didn't fizzle. Out, it exploded. He shouted, pacing the living room as Rex followed every move. Then he threw the coffee table aside, the crash waking Mason instantly. The baby screamed from the BASSI Netu. Donnelly rushed toward her child, but Daniel blocked her. Path, you don't walk away when I'm talking to you, he hissed. Daniel, please, she begged, her hands shaking. Just calm down. Then came the moment she would never forget. Daniel gave a sharp whistle, 2 quick bursts. It was a sound Emily had heard before during his training drills. It wasn't for her. It was for Rex. The German shepherd immediately went rigid, eyes fixed on her. She froze. "Rex guard," Daniel commanded. Before she could react, Rex lunged. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over a toy on the floor. She hit the ground hard, elbows scraping against the wood. Rex's bark echoed through the house as he closed in. He didn't bite, but his snarling teeth were inches from her face. His massive weight pressed down on her legs, pinning her in place. She screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of terror. She wasn't sure if Rex was going to stop. She wasn't sure if Daniel even wanted him to. Then Mason cried louder. A sharp wail cutting through the chaos. It was that sound, Emily believed, that pulled Daniel back from the edge. "Rex down," he ordered coldly. The dog backed away instantly, returning to Daniel's side like nothing had happened. Emily scrambled to Mason, scooping him into her arms. She didn't even feel the bruises on her legs or the sharp burn on her elbow. Her body ran on fear and adrenaline. She called 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and Emily's voice trembled as she begged for help. "Please, he sent the dog on me. I'm not safe." By the time officers arrived, Daniel had sobered his tone, standing calmly in the kitchen with Rex at his feet. He claimed Emily had tripped and fallen during an argument. He explained that Rex had never been commanded to attack and was trained not to bite unless under physical threat. He blamed her drama on postpartum stress and emotional instability. Bruises weren't enough. There were no bite marks. The baby was unharmed. There was no recording. Emily hadn't been able to turn on her phone in time. One of the officers took notes, but didn't ask too many questions. They all knew Daniel. They had trained with him, celebrated birthdays at the station with him. To them, Emily was just another emotional partner making a scene. She filed a report anyway, but within a week, it was closed. No charges, no follow-up, no apology. Emily tried to speak out, but no one listened. She was left feeling like a liar in her own town. Worse, Daniel was more confident than ever. He made sure she remembered how easily his badge and K-9 unit could make things disappear. After that, she filed for divorce. She moved into a rental apartment and started seeing a therapist. Mason, too young to explain what he'd witnessed, grew quieter. He had been a happy baby, but after that night, he startled easily at barking dogs and flinched when voices were raised. Emily never forgot. Not the scream, not the growl, not the whistle, but what haunted her most was Mason's silence. Years passed, and the custody battle began. Daniel pushed hard for joint custody, arguing that Emily was mentally unstable and filled with resentment. His legal team painted a polished picture: decorated officer, loving father, and pillar of the community. But now, in the courtroom years later, that picture had cracked. Emily sat quietly in her kitchen after court, staring out the window at the overcast sky. Mason sat at the table with a coloring book, humming softly. He looked so peaceful. She hadn't known if he remembered. She'd always wondered what stayed in a child's mind after trauma. She never pushed him to talk about it. She didn't want to plant memories that weren't his. But when he pointed at Rex and said, "Bad dog," she realized something important. He hadn't forgotten, and he hadn't misunderstood. That night had etched itself into his memory, just as deeply as hers. Now, it was the world's turn to remember. The morning after Mason's quiet courtroom bombshell, the town awoke to something it hadn't seen in decades. National attention. The clip of the toddler pointing at Rex and whispering "bad dog" had already gone viral overnight. News channels picked it up, talk shows replayed it, and online forums exploded with debates. Some praised Mason's bravery, calling it a breakthrough moment for victims of domestic abuse. Others accused Emily of coaching her son to sabotage a decorated officer's career, and some too many simply dismissed the boy's words as just something kids say. The town of Millersville, Georgia, suddenly found itself under a microscope. At the center of it all stood the police department, and most notably, Officer Daniel Carter and his dog Rex. For years, Daniel had been the department's golden boy. He led school safety talks, worked local parades, and was even featured on the town's website with Rex beside him in uniform. He wasn't just a cop, he was a public figure. And now, he was the target of a growing storm. Inside the department, things were already unraveling. 2 junior officers quietly told Internal Affairs they had long been uncomfortable with Daniel's authority over Rex. He didn't treat the dog like a partner, one said in a confidential interview. He treated him like a weapon he could unleash whenever he got mad. They described moments during training when Daniel would issue aggressive commands, using Rex to intimidate, not apprehend. They were told not to question him. He had seniority, another officer explained. And Rex never bit anyone on record. So we kept quiet. But now, with Mason's testimony stirring national outrage, silence was no longer an option. At a press conference held on the courthouse steps, Police Chief Robert Ellison tried to calm the flames. "We are taking the allegations against Officer Carter seriously. An internal investigation has been launched. However, I must emphasize that Rex has been a model K9 and has never had a confirmed incident of misconduct." A reporter shouted from the crowd, "What about the night of the domestic call? Was Rex officially deployed?" The chief hesitated. "At this point, our records do not indicate any K9 deployment during that incident, because the officer didn't report it." Another challenged. The question went unanswered. Across town, the division among residents grew. Half the community rallied behind Emily, believing her story and supporting her courage in standing up to a man with power. The other half doubled down behind Daniel, believing Mason was just a pawn in a bitter custody game. Even families were split. In the Carter household, Daniel's parents refused to believe their son had done anything wrong. His mother, Marianne, appeared on a morning talk show saying, "My son is a hero. That child is confused. Emily has always been dramatic. She's just trying to ruin his career." But Emily's best friend, Lila, wasn't having it. "I was there that night," she told a podcast interviewer. "Emily called me in tears after it happened. She couldn't even talk, just sobbed. She didn't make this up. She lived in fear. I watched her fade for months after that night." For Emily, the attention was both a blessing and a curse. She had longed to be heard, but she hadn't expected this storm. Her phone buzzed with calls, her inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, some filled with hate. One message read, "Lying B******. You're ruining a good man's life." Another simply said, "Finally someone stood up. Thank you for not giving up." Emily didn't respond to either. Instead, she focused on Mason, shielding him from the cameras, the noise, and the pressure. She turned down interviews and stayed away from social media. Her only goal was to protect her son. Meanwhile, Mason seemed unaffected by the chaos around him. He colored quietly, played with his toy dog, and occasionally asked why everyone suddenly wanted to see Rex. Emily would just kiss his forehead and say, "Because you're braver than most grown-ups." In court, things were heating up. Emily's lawyer requested that the court order a full review of all K9 deployment logs connected to Officer Carter for the past 5 years. To everyone's surprise, the judge agreed. That's when something strange happened. Several entries were missing. Rex's activity log, normally updated for every public engagement or deployment, had gaps. 2 nights showed blank entries, including the date of the incident Emily had reported. The court demanded answers, and pressure mounted on the department to cooperate. It became clear this was no longer just a custody case. It was turning into something far larger, a battle for institutional accountability. Then, A new player entered the scene. A retired K-9 supervisor named Wade Tillman reached out to Emily's attorney. He claimed he had once filed a complaint against Daniel for improper K-9 handling, but that it had mysteriously disappeared from his file. "Rex is smart," Wade said, "but dogs don't know the difference between a suspect and a spouse. They follow commands, always." His statement hit national news and ignited even more outrage. Hashtags exploded again. Hashtag justice for Emily. Hashtag K9 cover-up. Hashtag protect the innocent. Still, Daniel maintained his innocence. He released a statement through his attorney. "This is nothing more than a personal vendetta by a bitter ex-wife. My record speaks for itself. I have served this community with honor." But fewer people were listening. As the courtroom grew more tense, so did the national conversation. Can you trust a dog trained to obey blindly? And what happens when the person giving the orders abuses that trust? Mason's 2 words had forced an entire system to look in the mirror. The town was now fully divided, but one truth had become clear. This story wasn't over. The courthouse buzzed like a beehive on edge. What started as a custody dispute was now a full-blown investigation into the credibility of a decorated officer, the handling of a police dog, and the possibility of a cover-up within the Millersville Police Department. At the center of it all remained 3-year-old Mason, unaware of how his quiet words had shaken an entire system. Behind the scenes, Emily's attorney was pushing hard for access to internal K-9 records that had long been sealed under department confidentiality. That week, a breakthrough arrived in the form of a flash drive mailed anonymously to her office. It contained scanned copies of internal memos and disciplinary forms, some marked confidential, dating back nearly 5 years. Buried in the digital stack was a report never filed with the court, an incident log detailing a training accident where Rex bit a teenager during a community demonstration. The teen received minor injuries, and the report noted the dog reacted to a loud noise. But what stood out most was the signature at the bottom. Daniel Carter. It wasn't just a forgotten file. It had been intentionally removed from Rex's active service log. Emily's lawyer wasted no time. Within hours, she filed a motion to submit the document into evidence. The judge approved a special hearing to address the new findings. On the day of the hearing, cameras were banned from the courtroom, but word still spread like wildfire. Emily sat beside her lawyer, heart pounding as the document was read aloud. On March 16th, during a live demonstration at Jefferson High School, K-9 Rex reacted to a sudden loud sound and latched onto the forearm of a 16-year-old volunteer. The bite lasted approximately 4 seconds before release. Subject sustained puncture wounds. Medical treatment was administered on site. Officer Daniel Carter instructed not to file formal use of force paperwork. Internal documentation advised to classify the incident as training deviation to avoid PR complications. Gasps echoed softly across the courtroom. Even the judge looked stunned. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Your Honor, this proves a pattern." Officer Carter used his K-9 partner aggressively, and when it crossed the line, he covered it up. If he could do it during a high school event, what's stopping him from using Rex in his own home against his wife? Daniel's attorney stood up. This was a one-off mistake. It wasn't an attack, it was a misunderstanding. The dog responded instinctively. That's not a crime. The judge held up a hand. It's not just about the dog. It's about what was hidden. What else is missing? Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. A tall, weathered man stepped in, escorted by a court official. He wore a plain gray coat and held a folder tightly in his grip. He had been summoned that morning after confirming he had firsthand knowledge of the K-9 program's irregularities. It was Wade Tillman, the retired K-9 supervisor who had overseen Rex's early training. He took the witness stand and adjusted the microphone. "I oversaw Rex's training," he said. "He's a sharp dog, loyal, obedient to a fault. That's the thing with these dogs, they don't think for themselves. They listen. Whatever you tell them to do, they do it." The courtroom leaned in. Wade continued. "I raised concerns about Daniel early on. He was aggressive with commands, used the dog to assert dominance in situations that didn't require force. I filed a recommendation to suspend Rex's home deployment, but the memo vanished from the system within a month." Emily watched in stunned silence. It was everything she had felt, everything she had feared, but finally from someone with authority. Voice dropped lower. "I even warned a senior officer that Rex should not be brought into domestic space, especially during personal disputes. I said it once and never again. The culture made it clear, speak out and become the problem." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly disturbed. Daniel sat like stone, his jaw clenched, hands folded, staring forward without blinking. Outside, news trucks lined the streets. Rumors had already leaked about the testimony. A protest had formed near the courthouse gates, mothers, survivors, even retired officers holding signs that read, "Dogs follow orders." Who gave them? Silenced once, not again. Protect victims, not badges. Emily stepped outside during a brief recess and was met with quiet cheers. She didn't wave, didn't smile. Instead, she clutched her phone to her chest and whispered a prayer for strength, for safety, and for Mason's future. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. Back inside, the judge called the court back to order. "We are moving beyond a civil custody hearing," he announced. "The evidence presented today warrants a formal referral to state authorities. The court recommends immediate suspension of Officer Carter pending investigation and calls for full auditing of the K-9 program in Millersville." A beat passed, and he turned to Emily. "Ms. Carter, as of this moment, you are granted full temporary custody of your son, with no unsupervised visitation for the father until this investigation is resolved." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she covered her mouth. Mason, seated quietly in the back with a court-appointed guardian, looked up and smiled. He didn't understand everything, but he knew his mommy was happy. And she was, not just for herself, but for every voice that had ever been dismissed, every file that had been buried, and every child too afraid to speak. Mason had broken the silence. Now, the system had to listen. By the time Judge Halberton's ruling was finalized, the world outside Millersville had already taken notice, but now it exploded. News of Emily's court victory and Daniel's suspension hit every major outlet within hours. Morning shows aired. Deep dives on canine misuse. Podcasts debated the ethics of police dogs in personal residences. Talk show hosts praised Mason's courage. And by nightfall, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram were on fire. The moment that sparked it all, Mason pointing and whispering "bad dog" was now everywhere. Remixed into videos, looped with music, used as audio for emotional reels. It struck a nerve not just because of what was said, but because of who said it. A toddler, small and vulnerable, cutting through adult lies with childlike truth. Scrolled through her phone with trembling fingers. She had avoided the internet for most of the trial, but now it was impossible to ignore. Her inbox was full, some messages hateful, some hopeful. Strangers were pouring their hearts out to her. "I was attacked by my ex's dog during a fight. Police did nothing. I believed you the moment your son spoke. Thank you for not backing down. People like Daniel hide behind uniforms. You exposed that. But for every kind word, there were others. You're destroying a good man's life for attention. You brainwashed your child. Shame. The dog can't defend himself, but you're turning him into a villain. Emily closed the app. She didn't want fame. She didn't want attention. She wanted safety, truth, and protection for Mason. But she also knew the story had outgrown her now. It had taken on a life of its own, a symbol of something much bigger. Meanwhile, the court's decision triggered a domino effect. Multiple women in Millersville, inspired by Emily, stepped forward to report misconduct by officers they'd once feared. One woman said she'd filed a complaint about being threatened by an off-duty officer with his K9, but her report had mysteriously gone missing. Another claimed she was warned to stay quiet after her ex used his patrol dog to intimidate her during a custody exchange. The police department scrambled. Chief Ellison held a press conference, visibly tense. "We are initiating a full external audit of our K9 unit and officer conduct. We do not condone abuse of any kind, and we take these allegations seriously." But it was too late to contain the public outrage. A hashtag began trending across the country. Hashtag dogs don single quotes T-lie activists adopted the slogan to push for legislation limiting how and when K9 units could be used, especially in domestic environments. Some even proposed that police dogs no longer be housed in private residences, citing the blurred lines between personal power and professional enforcement. Protesters marched in front of courthouses and police stations in other cities, demanding transparency in K9 records and stronger accountability for officers. Journalists dug into old cases involving K9 injuries, and what they found only fueled the fire. Missing reports, overlooked bites, sealed settlements. Emily watched the chaos unfold from her apartment window. For the first time in months, Daniel had no legal access to Mason. The court order was clear, but her nerves remained. She double-checked the locks every night. She didn't trust silence anymore. She found peace only when holding Mason. He had become her anchor, the innocent soul who unknowingly unraveled a web of secrets and forced the world to see her truth. One evening, she sat on the edge of his bed, watching him color. "Why did you say that in court, sweetie?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear it again. Mason shrugged, his crayon scratching paper. "Because he was a bad dog, and you got scared." Emily bit her lip, her throat tightening. She pulled him close and whispered, "You're the bravest boy I know." Across town, Daniel sat in his darkened apartment, his world unraveling. His badge was suspended, his gun taken, and Rex, his only loyal companion, was temporarily removed from his care for reassessment. It hurt more than anything. He flipped through news clips, watching strangers dismantle his image. Every time someone said, "She was right," he slammed his fist into the couch. "She made me the villain." He muttered aloud. But in quiet corners of his mind, even he couldn't deny the memory of that night. The whistle, the way Rex had responded without hesitation, the way Emily had screamed, not out of performance, but out of real bone-deep terror. He had crossed a line, and now the world knew. Meanwhile, back in court, new hearings were being scheduled not just for Emily and Daniel, but for multiple other complaints now under investigation. Internal Affairs was in overdrive. Every complaint tied to the K9 unit, no matter how small, was being reviewed. One by one, the walls protecting the department's silence were crumbling. The governor of Georgia issued a public statement, applauding the judge's courage and calling for a statewide review of how K9 units are assigned and monitored. "Public trust must be earned, not assumed," he said. "And when the smallest among us speak the truth, we must listen." Emily played that clip several times that night, headphones on, tears in her eyes. Mason slept peacefully in his bed, unaware that his voice had become a rallying cry across the country. She looked down at a photo of herself, and Mason from before everything happened, before the courtrooms, before the accusations, before the 2 words that changed everything. Bad dog. It wasn't about blaming a dog. It was about revealing the truth behind who held the leash and what they did with that power. The courthouse was more crowded than ever. It had been weeks since Mason's quiet words ignited a national firestorm, and now everyone was waiting for the final reckoning. The courtroom was at full capacity. Journalists, advocates, quiet observers, even off-duty officers, all packed in. Emily sat calmly beside her attorney, but her heart thudded like a drum. Her fingers were laced tightly together in her lap, her knuckles white. Mason wasn't present this time. The court had decided it was best to keep him away from the final arguments for his safety and peace. Daniel entered minutes later, flanked by his legal team, his uniform replaced with a dark gray suit. He looked thinner, paler, his once arrogant demeanor subdued. The weight of public judgment and professional disgrace had carved deep lines into his face. Rex was not with him. The department had removed the dog weeks earlier, citing an active reassessment of service suitability. The courtroom doors closed. Judge Halberton appeared from chambers, files in hand, eyes weary but focused. "I've reviewed the testimonies, evidence and official reports submitted over the past month," he began, his voice heavy with gravity. "This case, which began as a custody dispute, has grown into something far more serious. But before we issue judgment, there's one more piece of evidence to review, something that came to light just days ago." Gasps spread through the room. No one had expected new information at this late stage. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to submit a voice recording found on Miss Carter's phone specifically, a voice memo automatically backed up from over 2 years ago." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Emily's heart dropped. She hadn't known her attorney had found it or intended to use it. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The courtroom hushed as the recording played from a small speaker placed on the bench. First, static. Then, Daniel's voice, raised and aggressive. "You don't get to walk away." Emily's frightened tone followed. "Please don't do this. He's asleep." Then came the whistle. 2 sharp bursts. A bark. Another bark, louder, closer. Then her scream. The audio cut there. Emily closed her eyes. The memory punched through her chest again, raw and real. She could hear the courtroom reacting, gasps, murmurs, even a few suppressed sobs. The judge raised a hand, signaling silence. "That," he said, "is the clearest window we've had into the incident in question." Daniel's lawyer stood, pale-faced. "Your Honor, the clip is incomplete. It doesn't prove physical contact, only noise." "Dogs bark." The judge cut him off. Officer Carter gave a trained command. The dog responded. His partner screamed. That much is beyond dispute. Daniel stared down at the table, jaw twitching. He had no more cards to play. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew louder as the news of the recording hit social media. Live streams picked up commentary from legal experts and victims' rights groups. The hashtag Justice for Mason began trending. For the first time, alongside hashtag Bad Dog Truth, hashtag Emily was right, and hashtag Who Gave the Command. Back inside, the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. In custody matters, the court's primary concern is always the welfare of the child. In this case, overwhelming evidence including physical testimony, professional evaluations, and now audio confirmation demonstrates that Officer Carter used his canine partner in a manner inconsistent with the law and safety of his household. He turned to Emily. You are hereby awarded full legal and physical custody of Mason Carter. Officer Carter shall have no unsupervised visitation and must undergo psychological evaluation and anger management counseling before any further custody considerations are heard. Emily exhaled so deeply, it sounded like a sob. Her attorney gripped her shoulder. The judge continued. Additionally, based on evidence presented regarding officer misconduct, this court is formally recommending criminal charges be reviewed and pursued by the state prosecutor's office. Emily turned slowly to face Daniel. He didn't look up. He was crumbling, and the whole courtroom could see it. Her attorney leaned over and whispered, "It's over. You did it." But Emily didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted, not just from the legal battle, but from the years of being silenced, gaslit, and doubted. From the pain of knowing her son had carried a scar he didn't have words for until he finally did. After court, she stepped outside to the roaring sound of applause. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs and cameras. Some held flowers. A few cried. Reporters pushed forward, but Emily shook her head. She wasn't here to give a speech. She wasn't here to celebrate. She simply waved, holding back tears, and walked down the steps. At the bottom, waiting with her sister, was Mason. He reached for her hand, his tiny fingers curling around hers. "Is the dog gone now?" he asked. Emily knelt down and hugged him tight. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "The dog's gone, and we're safe now." In that moment, she didn't care about the headlines or the hashtags. She didn't care that people would talk about her or twist her story. All that mattered was this: she had believed in her son's voice. And finally, the world had listened. The courtroom drama was over, but for Emily and Mason, the journey toward healing was just beginning. With full custody secured, Emily set out to rebuild their lives free from fear and secrets. She moved them to a new town a few hours away somewhere. Quiet, where no one knew their story, and Mason could grow without shadows hanging over him. Their new apartment was small, but warm, filled with soft colors and sunlight. Mason loved the little garden outside, where they planted daisies and watched butterflies. Emily worked hard to create a safe, loving space where her son could be a child again. Therapy sessions became part of their routine. Mason attended play therapy with a gentle counselor who helped him find words for feelings he couldn't express before. Slowly, his smiles grew more frequent, his sleep less restless. He even started to enjoy dogs again, tiny friendly ones. At the park, Emily found support in local groups for domestic abuse survivors. She shared her story cautiously, mindful of Mason's privacy, but grateful for the understanding and community. She realized that breaking silence wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous act of courage. Meanwhile, back in Millersville, the ripple effects of the case continued. The state prosecutor launched a full criminal investigation into Officer Daniel Carter's conduct. The K-9 unit was put on probation, with new oversight policies established to prevent abuse and cover-ups. Police officers were required to undergo retraining on the ethical use of service animals, and new laws were proposed to mandate transparency whenever a K-9 was deployed. The town slowly began to heal, too. Conversations about power, trust, and accountability grew in public forums, schools, and homes. The story of a toddler's brave 2 words became a symbol of how even the smallest voices can spark big change. One afternoon, months later, Emily and Mason visited the local library. Mason was eager to check out books about dogs and police officers curious, but no longer afraid. They sat side by side on a bench, reading stories that made Mason giggle and ask questions. "Mommy," he said suddenly, pointing to a picture of a smiling German shepherd in a children's book, "is this a good dog?" Emily smiled softly. "Yes, baby, some dogs are very good. And some people learn how to be better, too." Mason hugged the book tightly. "Maybe one day, Rex can learn to be a good dog, too," he whispered. Emily's heart swelled. She knew there was no magic fix, no perfect ending. But there was hope. Hope that truth could break chains, that voices, even tiny ones, could change the world, and that healing was possible, no matter how deep the wounds. As they walked out of the library hand in hand, Emily glanced down at Mason's bright, curious eyes. He was no longer just a toddler who spoke 2 words in a courtroom. He was a brave boy, a survivor, and a reminder that courage can come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, all it takes is 2 words. Bad dog.